It began on a morning that looked too peaceful to hold anything tragic. The sun was barely awake, spilling a quiet gold over the Bitterroot Mountains. The air smelled of wet cedar and melting frost, the kind of stillness that feels like a prayer before the world begins again. Caleb Morgan, a wildlife photographer with more patience than most people could stand, was standing knee-deep in the dew-soaked grass along Bitterroot Creek. He had been out there since before dawn, hoping to capture the slow unfurling of morning light across the river bend. He didn't know that what he was about to witness would make even the most seasoned veterinarian cry. It happened in seconds, too fast for thought, too strange for reason. From the corner of his lens, Caleb caught movement on the far bank, a blur of tan and gold, a flash of muscle and instinct. At first, he assumed it was just another wildcat coming to drink at the river, but then something shifted in his gut. The animal wasn't pausing. It was charging, straight into the current. The Bitterroot in early spring is no gentle stream. The snowmelt turns it into a living thing, cold, violent, and unpredictable. And yet, through that icy turbulence, a pregnant bobcat, her belly full and heavy, was fighting her way across. Her name, though he wouldn't learn it until much later, was Maris. When she reached the middle of the river, Caleb's camera caught what looked like a struggle, but not the kind he expected. The bobcat's head disappeared under the surface. Seconds dragged. The water spun, clawed, bit at her strength. And then there she was again, emerging with something in her jaws. A puppy, a small golden puppy, limp and slick with river water. Caleb's hands shook so badly the first seconds of footage blurred. He steadied himself, whispering aloud, "You've got to be kidding me." He kept filming, not out of habit but out of disbelief, because everything in nature, everything he had learned in his 20 years photographing predators, told him what should have happened next. A pregnant bobcat burning through energy reserves, she needed to survive her own labor, should not risk her life for prey. That's not instinct. That's suicide. And yet that's exactly what she was doing. You could hear the sound of the river's roar fade under something quieter, the trembling sound of breath returning to small lungs. The puppy, barely conscious, was dangling from Maris's mouth, its fur plastered flat to its fragile ribs. Its body looked more gone than alive. But the bobcat's steps, careful, deliberate, carried it up the muddy slope away from the biting cold. Once on the bank, she did something even more impossible. She didn't kill. She didn't feed. She laid the puppy down, and then, like a mother desperate to keep a newborn breathing, she began to lick the water from its face. Long, patient strokes of her rough tongue. Again. Again. The puppy coughed. Once, then again, a faint, pitiful sound. But it was enough. Caleb lowered the camera, his chest tight. For years, he'd captured moments of life and death, a hawk's dive, a fox's hunger, the cold calculus of the wild. But this was different. It wasn't about nature's hierarchy. It was about mercy. Raw, inexplicable mercy. He whispered, "You're not supposed to do that." But maybe she didn't know the rules, or maybe she just didn't care. Later, Caleb would try to explain it to people. He'd talk about the way the morning light hit the river, the cold, the danger. He'd show them the footage, the proof. But somehow it never translated. Because what made the moment unforgettable wasn't just what she did. It was what it felt like to watch it happen. He said it felt like the wild itself was offering a truce. Like something ancient and invisible had decided just for that morning that kindness mattered more than survival. He couldn't shake the sound of the river in those moments. The silence after the puppy coughed. The soft rasp of the bobcat's tongue against wet fur. It was the same sound his grandmother used to make when she comforted a crying baby, slow, rhythmic, patient. Kindness, he realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it walks on four paws. Caleb had spent his life chasing proof that wild animals were predictable, explainable, that their behaviors followed patterns humans could name and file away. But watching Maris, he saw something no textbook could describe. Her body was trembling from cold and exhaustion. Every breath she took was visible, her sides heaving with the effort of existing. Yet she stayed. She didn't retreat to the woods or find shelter. She kept licking the puppy, watching, waiting. He wondered if she had lost kittens before, if some hidden memory inside her had recognized another fragile life on the edge of vanishing. Whatever the reason, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that she had chosen compassion over instinct. And that choice was rewriting everything Caleb thought he understood about nature and about himself. If you ask biologists, they'll tell you that survival drives every creature. But standing there in the wet grass, camera forgotten at his side, Caleb found himself asking another question entirely. What if compassion is nature's survival, too? Because maybe it wasn't just about saving another life. Maybe it was about balance, a quiet act of grace to remind the world that mercy still had a place in the wild. He thought of the people back in town, folks who passed each other without eye contact, who'd stopped helping strays, who'd forgotten to call their neighbors just to say hello. What if this moment, this wild creature's act of kindness, could remind them of something, that even when the world feels cold, life keeps finding ways to be warm? Caleb followed Maris at a distance, careful not to spook her. She carried the puppy into a hollow beneath an overhanging rock, a dry pocket sheltered from the wind. She curled herself around the small creature, her breathing steady, her fur creating warmth. The puppy whimpered once, a sound halfway between fear and trust. And then silence. The kind of silence that holds peace, not emptiness. He stayed there until the sun climbed higher and the frost began to melt from the branches. The world looked the same as it had an hour ago, and yet it wasn't. Something unseen had shifted in the air in him. He knew he couldn't leave them. He also knew he couldn't help them alone. So he pulled out his phone, his fingers still numb from the cold, and called someone he trusted more than anyone else when it came to matters of life and wildness. "Dr. Bennett," he said, "you need to come to Bitterroot Creek. There's something here I think you need to see." A pause. Static. Then her voice calm, skeptical. "A bobcat rescue." "Not exactly," he said softly. "It's something else." Something else. He didn't have the words for it yet, but he knew that if anyone could understand what he had just seen, it would be her. A woman who had spent her life healing broken creatures, even when she herself was still learning how to heal. As he waited for her to arrive, Caleb sat near the creek, the camera resting in his lap. The footage played back in the small screen glow, the frantic swirl of water, the bobcat's struggle, the tiny gasp of the puppy's breath. He thought of the river differently now. He used to see it as a line between life and death, between what survives and what doesn't. But today, it felt like something else entirely. A mirror, maybe. Reflecting back on everything humans forget about themselves. Courage, compassion, the instinct to reach out instead of turn away. He watched the last seconds again, the frame where Maris lays the puppy down. The light catches her eyes just before she bows her head to lick the water from its fur. In that split second, her expression isn't predatory. It's maternal. It's love, raw, unpolished, and entirely unexplainable. And that he thought might just be the most natural thing of all. We often think of the wild as cruel a place of tooth and claw where only the strongest survive. But maybe that's just one version of the truth. Maybe there's another quieter version, the kind you only see when you're patient enough to look, when you stop trying to define and just witness. Because out there in the hush of dawn, a pregnant bobcat named Maris reminded one man and soon an entire town that kindness isn't human property. It's a language older than words, older than reason. And it started with a single act. A mother's instinct that crossed the line between wild and human, rewriting what survival could mean. If this moment were the only one Caleb captured that year, it would have been enough. But as you'll soon see, it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something extraordinary, a chain of compassion that would ripple far beyond the riverbank. Stay with me. In the next part, we'll meet the woman who answered that call and how a single encounter between a wild heart and a human one would leave her forever changed. When Caleb pressed play on his camera that afternoon, his hands were still trembling. Not from the cold, but from the impossible warmth he'd felt watching it happen. He had replayed the footage a dozen times already, each time hoping that reason might return to it somehow. That the camera would expose a trick of light, a misunderstanding, anything that might explain what he saw. But the lens doesn't lie. It never has. There she was, Maurice, the pregnant bobcat, dragging herself from the river with that golden puppy still clutched gently between her teeth. You could see it in her eyes the moment instinct gave way to something else. Something that looked almost human. And for the first time in his 20 years of filming wildlife, Caleb realized he wasn't just a photographer anymore. He was a witness. Caleb had started his career chasing danger tornadoes in Oklahoma, wolves in Yellowstone storms at sea. He believed the wild was most honest when it was violent, when it showed the side of nature humans tried to forget. But what he'd seen that morning didn't fit into any of that. It wasn't a fight for dominance or survival. It was grace. Unexpected, tender, silent grace. And as he scrolled through the playback frame by frame, something inside him began to ache. Because while everyone else would later call it a miracle, he felt something more personal. It felt like the wild had let him see a secret. You can hear his breathing in the audio. The faint crunch of his boots as he shifted, not wanting to scare her. And then, in that still frame, the moment Maris lowers the puppy onto the rocks, Caleb whispers, almost to himself, "She's saving him." It wasn't a statement. It was a realization. The kind of realization that makes you reevaluate the last 20 years of your life. In wildlife photography, you're trained to stay detached, to observe, not intervene. You document, you don't participate. But in that moment, detachment felt wrong. Watching her work to bring that puppy back felt too close to love to ignore. She licked its fur dry. She nudged it softly with her nose. When it whimpered, she froze as if listening for something deep inside the sound. Every action was purposeful, every movement measured. And through it all, Caleb just watched. He didn't adjust his settings or chase better angles. He didn't move closer or try to frame the perfect shot. For once, he let the camera roll and his own heartbeat decide the rhythm. In the soft morning light, the scene looked more like devotion than survival. Later, when the Wildlife Center reviewed his footage, one of the biologists said it almost looked rehearsed, as if Maris had known what to do step by step. Caleb laughed quietly at that. She didn't rehearse, he said. She remembered. He told them about how she had carried the puppy, not by the scruff of its neck as predators do, but by its midsection supporting it carefully. How she'd paused midstream to readjust her grip when the current tried to take them both. There was intelligence in it, yes, but also something deeper, a tenderness that defied every rule written about predator behavior. Caleb had always thought kindness belonged to people, that empathy was ours alone. That morning, he watched that belief dissolve. As the hours passed, the camera stayed steady, but his focus shifted. He wasn't studying her anymore. He was learning from her. There's a quiet kind of humility that comes when the wild teaches you something you didn't know you needed to learn. It reminds you that you're not the measure of compassion, just one expression of it. The puppy stirred in her care, little more than a heartbeat wrapped in gold fur. Its breathing grew steadier, and though it was still weak, it nestled against the warmth of her body, as if it had known her all along. Watching them, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of meaning. He remembered his wife once telling him, "You see everything, Caleb, but you never feel it." She said it kindly, a truth spoken without judgment. Now sitting by the creek with tears drying on his face, he wondered if maybe she'd been right. We think of wildness as something separate from us, distant, unpredictable, even dangerous. But that morning, the wild wasn't separate at all. It was intimate, familiar, like a mirror we'd forgotten how to look into. He realized that maybe nature's language had never been about dominance or fear, but about connection. About what happens when one life recognizes the worth in another. He thought of how the bobcat had risked everything, her strength, her unborn kittens, her safety for a creature that should have been her meal. What could drive an animal to do that? Maybe the same thing that drives people to step into rushing water to save a stranger. Maybe compassion isn't a choice we make. Maybe it's written somewhere deeper, older than thought. Standing there, camera in hand, Caleb realized the question wasn't why she did it. The real question was, what was he going to do with what he'd just witnessed? He knew he couldn't leave her alone. She was still trembling from exhaustion, her fur soaked and heavy. The puppy was alive but fragile, its tiny ribs rising and falling like fragile reeds. If either of them were to survive, they would need help. So he did the only thing that felt right. He set the camera on the tripod, focused it on the hollow beneath the rocks where Maris had taken shelter, and pressed record again, not to capture for an audience, but to bear witness to whatever would happen next. And then he stepped back far enough not to interfere close enough to protect. Hours passed. The light changed, shadows lengthened, and through it all, the bobcat stayed. At one point, when the wind picked up, she lifted her head and looked directly toward where Caleb stood. For a heartbeat, their eyes met through the distance. He would describe it later as the most honest look he'd ever received. Not fear, not curiosity, something else, trust. It wasn't human trust, not exactly. It was older than that. The kind that says, I see you, and I know you mean no harm. That was the moment, he said, when everything inside him softened. When dusk settled, the air grew colder. The last of the daylight touched the water like a fading memory. Caleb sat near his truck, listening to the night gather itself around the forest. Every sound, every rustle, every breath felt alive with significance. He thought about his own life, about how he had built walls between himself and the world, one photograph at a time. Always the observer, never the participant. But today had changed that. Today he'd watched mercy in its rawest form. And it wasn't a human sermon or a scientific lecture. It was a living, breathing act of love in the most unlikely place. He smiled quietly to himself. Guess the wild doesn't need our permission to be good, he murmured. When he finally gathered his equipment, he noticed something odd. His camera battery, usually dead by afternoon, still had plenty of charge. He laughed softly, shaking his head. Looks like even the tech wants to see how this ends. That night, he slept in the back of his truck, beneath the stars, the camera still rolling a few yards away. Every so often, he'd wake to check the footage, listening for any sound from the den. The bobcat's soft movements, the puppy's weak whimper. And each time he heard them, he whispered a thank you he couldn't explain, not to God, exactly not to luck, but to the strange mercy that had unfolded before his eyes. By morning, he had made his decision. He needed help, real help. Someone who could care for the puppy and maybe understand what this act meant. He scrolled through his phone, searching for the one person who could bridge the world between wild instinct and human reason, Dr. Nora Bennett. The veterinarian who had spent half her life saving wildcats from a world that had forgotten how to care for them. When she answered, her voice was groggy but calm. Caleb. This better not be another porcupine rescue. He laughed under his breath. Not this time. What is it then? He hesitated, searching for words that could make sense of what he'd seen. It's a bobcat, pregnant, and a puppy. She pulled him out of the river. Silence. Then quietly, What? You need to see it, Caleb said. I think it's something we're not supposed to understand. As the call ended, he looked once more toward the hollow where Maris lay curled around the puppy. The early sun caught the edge of her fur, turning it to amber. The puppy twitched in its sleep. He lifted the camera again, not as a tool, but as an offering, a way of saying, I see you. I'll remember this. If you've ever found yourself staring at something too beautiful to explain, you'll understand what Caleb felt that day. He wasn't chasing proof anymore. He was chasing meaning. And sometimes meaning doesn't roar or announce itself. It just looks back at you through amber eyes, daring you to believe. Stay with me, because in the next part, we'll meet Dr. Nora Bennett, the woman who arrived with logic and science, and left with tears she couldn't quite explain. Dr. Nora Bennett was halfway through her first cup of coffee when the call came. Her mornings were usually predictable. Check the rehab ward, feed the owls, log the medical charts, the quiet rhythm of a woman who had traded city noise for the company of wild things. But that morning, the voice on the other end carried something she hadn't heard in a long time, disbelief wrapped in awe. Nora, Caleb said, breathless, You need to come to Bitterroot Creek. There's something you won't believe. She smiled wearily at first, assuming it was another coyote pup or an orphaned deer. Caleb always had a soft spot for lost creatures. But then he said, A pregnant bobcat pulled a puppy from the river. The smile faded. what she asked, thinking she'd misheard. She saved him, Nora. She didn't kill it. She's caring for it. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the pines swayed in a slow, whispering rhythm. Finally, she exhaled. "Text me your coordinates." She didn't know what she'd find out there, but something in his voice, that unsteady reverence, told her it wasn't just another field call. It was something else. She packed quickly tranquilizer darts, medical kit, thermal blankets, the essentials of both science and mercy. Her truck rumbled down the narrow mountain road, tires kicking up last night's rain. To anyone else, it might have looked like just another rescue run. But inside, Nora's heart was at war with itself. Science had always been her language, the clean precision of data, the certainty of patterns. She had built her life around the idea that every mystery, no matter how emotional, had an answer. But as the miles passed, reason began to lose its footing. How could a predator save its prey? How could instinct bend toward compassion, somewhere between logic and faith? A question began to take root. What if this wasn't a mistake of instinct? What if it was something intentional? By the time Nora reached the clearing, the sun had begun to thin the fog. Caleb was waiting near the river camera, slung over his shoulder, his face pale in that stunned, reverent way that only comes from witnessing the unexplainable. Without a word, he pointed toward a cluster of rocks beneath an overhang. "There," he whispered. Nora followed his gaze. Through the low brush, she saw a shape curled in the shadows. The pregnant bobcat Maris, her tawny fur pressed around something smaller, paler. The puppy. The world seemed to narrow to that one quiet image, the rise and fall of two bodies breathing in rhythm. For a long moment, Nora forgot to move. She had spent her career studying animal behavior, maternal patterns, hormonal surges, the mechanics of instinct. But no equation could account for this. It was like watching the laws of nature pause to make room for love. She crouched down, keeping her distance, and began to speak softly, her voice low and steady. Not words meant to be understood, but tones meant to reassure. "Easy, girl," she murmured. "I'm not here to hurt you." The bobcat's ears twitched, but she didn't retreat. Her amber eyes flicked toward Nora, alert yet calm, as if she had already decided there was no danger here. Caleb whispered, "She's been like that since the rescue. She doesn't leave the puppy." Nora's throat tightened. She took a slow step forward, crouching lower. In the hollow of that small den, the puppy stirred, its sides fluttering with shallow breaths, a faint whimper slipping out. Maris nudged it gently with her nose, then looked up at Nora again. And in that exchange, wild mother to human caretaker, something passed between them. A quiet surrender, a shared understanding. Nora spoke again, her voice shaking now. "It's okay. I'll help you both." Later, she would try to rationalize that moment, call it maternal projection or instinctive communication, but in truth, it felt like something deeper. She remembered the child she had lost years ago, the small heartbeat that had flickered and vanished before she ever got to hold it. She rarely spoke of it, even to herself. But standing there watching Maris shelter that tiny life, the memory returned like a tide she couldn't stop. She realized she wasn't just looking at a wild animal. She was looking at a reflection of every mother's prayer. Please let them live. Sometimes it's not science that breaks us open. It's the gentle mercy of something we can't explain. When she finally approached close enough to check the puppy's breathing, she expected resistance, a hiss, a growl, the swift swipe of claws. But Maris only shifted slightly, giving her space. It was as if the bobcat understood this woman was part of the rescue too. Nora worked quickly. The puppy was hypothermic, pulse faint but present. She rubbed its chest gently, wrapping it in a thermal blanket from her kit. "Stay with me," she whispered over and over. When the puppy coughed, weak but defiant, both women, wild and human, reacted the same way. They froze, then exhaled in relief. Caleb caught it on film the moment Dr. Nora Bennett smiled through tears, and the bobcat lifted her head, mirroring that same expressionless grace. Two caretakers from different worlds, united by a single heartbeat. If there was ever a moment where science met soul, it was this one. On the drive back to the sanctuary, the puppy nestled on Nora's lap inside a blanket, its warmth slowly returning. Caleb followed behind in his truck, transporting the sedated bobcat. Every curve of that mountain road felt like a meditation. Nora couldn't stop replaying the image, the water, the rescue, the trust. She'd spent her whole life trying to define love through biology, but now she was wondering if maybe love was what biology had been trying to explain all along. She thought of her students, of the way she used to tell them wildlife isn't emotional. It's functional. Now she wasn't so sure. Maybe the wild wasn't cold at all. Maybe it was full of quiet, unseen acts of compassion that happened far from human eyes. Sometimes she thought the miracle isn't that the wild can be kind. It's that we're allowed to witness it. By the time they arrived at the Bitterroot Wildlife Center, the sky had begun to darken. Rain streaked the glass roof as Nora carried the puppy inside, Caleb just behind her, with the crate holding Maris. Inside, the center buzzed to life. Assistants hurried to prepare isolation units, warming lamps, and IV fluids. The quiet chaos of care. But even in the noise, there was reverence. No one spoke above a whisper when the bobcat's crate was wheeled in. Maris stirred, faintly groggy from sedation, her swollen belly rising and falling. Nora reached through the bars, brushing a hand along the metal frame. "You did good, Mama," she murmured. She set the puppy nearby, letting Maris see it through the transparent divider. The bobcat's breathing steadied instantly. Her gaze softened. Nora felt a lump in her throat. This wasn't predator and prey anymore. This was something sacred, an unspoken pact between two mothers who had both chosen life over fear. That night, after the center went quiet, Nora sat alone in her office. The puppy slept on a heating pad beside her, a tiny golden bundle of second chances. Outside the observation window, Maris watched through the glass, her amber eyes glinting in the dim light. Nora sipped cold coffee journal, open but untouched. She didn't know how to write what she had seen. How do you record an event that breaks the boundaries of science, yet heals something inside the human heart? She wrote one line, then paused. Today I witnessed the wild choose compassion. It wasn't data. It wasn't proof. It was something greater, a bridge between knowing and believing. For the first time in years, she felt like both the scientist and the woman inside her could breathe the same air. When the puppy stirred, Nora reached over, gently resting her palm on its side. Its heartbeat was strong now, rhythmic, certain. She smiled. "You're going to make it, little one." And maybe she was speaking to herself too. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds thinned, revealing a single streak of silver moonlight cutting through the dark. Quiet reminder that even in the aftermath of chaos, light finds its way. Tomorrow, she would run tests, analyze hormones, and write reports. But tonight, she just sat there, listening to the sound of breathing hers, the puppy's, and somewhere beyond the glass, the steady hum of a wild mother watching over them both. If you've ever questioned whether compassion has limits, remember this. Sometimes the wild answers our doubt with a miracle so gentle we almost miss it. Stay with me. In the next part, you'll see what happens when that fragile thread of trust between predator-prey and the people who care begins to grow into something none of them could have imagined. There are moments when time seems to pause, not because the world stops, but because two living beings choose to meet halfway. That night inside the dim light of the Bitterroot Wildlife Center, one such moment unfolded. A wild mother stood on one side of the glass, a human one on the other, and between them a fragile, golden heartbeat that belonged to both. Nora had been awake for almost 20 hours. Her hands were steady, but her mind kept circling back to that look Maris had given her by the river, the kind that carried no fear or rage, only the simple language of need. She knew what she was supposed to do: observe, record, maintain professional distance. But the sterile line between human and animal had already blurred the moment Maris stepped forward and placed that dying puppy at her boots. Now standing in the quiet hum of the isolation ward, Nora realized something she'd never said aloud in her years of field medicine. Science may heal the body, but trust heals the space between. She turned off the overhead lights, letting the room fall into the gentle blue of the night monitors. The puppy, now stabilized, slept beneath the soft glow of a warming lamp. Beyond the glass, Maris paced slow, deliberate, alert. Caleb, seated in the corner with his camera off, whispered, "She hasn't taken her eyes off him once." Nora nodded. She's not just guarding him. She's waiting. Waiting for what? For me, Nora said quietly. To prove I'm not going to take him away. When working with wild predators, trust is measured in silence, not touch. It begins with stillness, patience, and the willingness to listen without understanding. So Nora sat on the floor, her back against the cool wall of the enclosure, not facing the glass, but beside it, where she could be seen, but not looming. She read the monitors quietly, keeping her movements small. Every few minutes, she spoke softly simple words with calm rhythm. You're safe here. He's safe. I know you're tired. You did well. To anyone else, it might have sounded foolish talking to a bobcat like a patient who could understand English. But to Maris, tone mattered more than language. And in the steady hum of the sanctuary, that tone became a bridge. Hours passed. At 2:17 a.m., the puppy stirred, letting out a small broken whimper. Nora rose instantly, checking his vitals. Across the room, Maris froze. Her muscles tensed, her ears flicked forward. For a moment, instinct battled instinct, wild protection versus human care. Nora felt it in her bones, the weight of 1,000 years of mistrust between her kind and Maris's. Predator and protector, fear and faith. She whispered, "It's okay. I'm just helping him breathe." She lifted the puppy carefully, pressing the small oxygen mask to its nose. The machine hissed gently, steady as a lullaby. Maryse took one step forward, her claws clicking softly on the cement. Her eyes didn't flash with aggression. They were full of something harder to name worry. Nora met that gaze and held it. "You saved him once," she said softly. "Let me help you do it again." For a long, impossible moment, the wild mother didn't move, and then she exhaled. Her body eased. She sat. That's how trust begins, one breath shared between two hearts who should have feared each other. Caleb caught it all in silence. Later, he would say that it wasn't the science that made the scene miraculous. It was the stillness. The way the wild and the human simply decided not to run. Watching through the glass, he felt a lump rise in his throat. The lens he'd once used to distance himself from the world now reflected something entirely different connection. He whispered into his recorder. She's not a predator tonight. She's a mother. And so is Nora. Trust across fear, he thought, might be the rarest kind of courage, because it asks you to stand close to what once hurt you and believe it won't hurt you again. As dawn broke, the sanctuary's windows filled with pale light. Outside, frost melted from the pines, dripping like small tears down the glass. Inside, Maris had stopped pacing. She was resting her head low, eyes half closed. The puppy was breathing normally now, wrapped in a nest of blankets that smelled faintly of cedar shavings. Nora leaned her forehead against the glass, whispering more to herself than anyone else. "You trusted me with your miracle," she said. "I won't let that be in vain." It struck her then how fragile the word wild really was. It wasn't a warning, as humans often used it. It was a description of freedom, of love without condition, of instincts not yet ruined by calculation. And maybe that's why this mattered so much, because the wild was reminding her what humanity sometimes forgot. Trust doesn't need understanding. It just needs gentleness. For the first time in years, Nora felt that gentleness flow both ways. When the other staff arrived at sunrise, they found her asleep beside the glass, her head resting on her arm. The puppy had shifted closer to the divider in his sleep, and on the other side, Maris had done the same. Two bodies separated by human construction, but bound by something far older. One of the interns whispered, "Do you think they know they're different species?" Caleb, who had been sitting nearby all night, smiled faintly. Not in the ways that matter. Later that morning, as Nora prepared to step into the enclosure for the first time, she hesitated. Every instinct as a scientist told her to be cautious. Every instinct as a woman told her to be brave. She opened the door slowly. The latch clicked like the turning of a clock, measuring not time, but trust. Maris didn't flinch. She lifted her head, watching with those deep amber eyes, then shifted just enough to make space near the puppy. Nora knelt. Her voice trembled. "Thank you." That was it. No grand gesture, no dramatic music. just a whisper of gratitude exchanged between species who had no reason to understand it, yet somehow did. For the next few days, Nora and Maris worked as silent partners. When the puppy cried, both responded. When Nora adjusted his IV, Maris watched but stayed calm. One afternoon, when the puppy whimpered in its sleep, Maris began to make a soft chirping sound, a sound only mother bobcats make to comfort their kittens. Nora's eyes filled instantly. She realized that the sound she was hearing wasn't meant for the wild or the domestic, it was meant for the living. It was kindness spoken in a language older than fear. And that's when Nora understood something she would later write in her research notes, though it felt more like a confession than data. When love becomes instinct, fear becomes irrelevant. She began to visit Maris and the puppy every evening after the staff had gone home. Sometimes she'd read aloud from her journals. Sometimes she'd just sit in silence, tracing the outlines of her thoughts. She found herself wondering if all living things were designed for this connection beyond comprehension. It wasn't that fear disappeared. It just became something they could both hold without letting it rule them. Fear was the thing that brought them to the edge of the river. Trust was what helped them both cross it. In that way, they weren't so different after all. By the end of the week, the bond had deepened in ways Nora couldn't explain. Maris would rest her head near the divider whenever Nora entered the room, her eyes following every motion with calm precision. And the puppy, once barely alive, now wagged its tail weakly whenever the bobcat moved. Even the center staff had begun to speak differently about them, not as predator and prey, but as a pair. The unlikely mother and her adopted child. One intern started calling the puppy Scout. The name stuck. Caleb, reviewing his footage, whispered to Nora one afternoon, "You know, I thought I came here to film a miracle." She looked up from her charts and he smiled. "Turns out, I'm watching faith. Sometimes healing begins when two hearts stop trying to protect themselves and simply trust. And sometimes that trust becomes the quiet bridge that carries them both towards something bigger than survival." Stay with me, because in the next part we'll see how that bridge, the bond between a wild mother and a human heart, would begin to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the sanctuary walls. Some languages don't need translation, languages older than speech, carried in the tilt of a head, the warmth of a gaze, the rhythm of breath shared between living things. That morning inside the Bitterroot Wildlife Center, one such language filled the air. It wasn't English or science or sound. It was kindness spoken through silence. Nora had stayed the night again. She didn't mean to. She'd promised herself she'd go home, take a shower, maybe sleep in her own bed for once. But when she'd reached the door the night before, she'd heard it, the soft whimper of the puppy, the low rumble of the bobcat's purr in response, and she couldn't leave. So she pulled up a chair beside the glass divider, her notes spread across her lap. In front of her, two lives that should have been enemies slept side by side, one golden and fragile, the other fierce and spotted, yet calm. It was the kind of peace you don't see in textbooks. She whispered, mostly to herself, This is what survival really looks like. When people talk about kindness, they often treat it like a choice, something deliberate, almost ceremonial. But watching Maris and Scout Nora realized that kindness is more instinct than intention. It's the natural pull toward warmth, the quiet rebellion against fear. Every morning, Maris greeted the staff with watchful calm, no longer hiding her kittens under her belly when Nora entered. Scout would wag his tail not wildly, but in a slow, cautious rhythm that mirrored the heartbeat of trust. Caleb's camera had captured hundreds of hours of footage by then, yet every frame carried the same truth. Nothing about this was performative. The wild mother didn't know she was teaching humans anything. She was just loving. Love as language, kindness as instinct. One afternoon, a storm rolled over the mountains, sharp, lightning rolling thunder that shook the glass panes of the sanctuary. Scout startled first, his small body trembling under the weight of each booming echo. He whimpered, pressing himself flat against the floor. Maris lifted her head. She could have retreated deeper into the nesting corner. But instead she stretched one paw over the puppy, curling her body protectively around him. Nora and Caleb stood frozen behind the observation window. Lightning flashed again. Maris didn't flinch. She pressed closer. Her fur absorbed his shaking. Her warmth silenced his fear. Nora whispered, "She's teaching him the world isn't as cruel as it sounds." Caleb nodded, voice thick. "And maybe she's teaching us too." Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the sanctuary held steady. Kindness, Nora thought, isn't about what you feel, it's about what you offer when you have nothing left to give. Maris had every reason to choose distance. She was still recovering, still carrying new life inside her. Yet when faced with fear not her own, but another's, she responded with comfort. It made Nora think of her patients, the humans who visited her after lectures, their hands trembling as they asked if animals could really feel love. She always said yes, but she had never truly known how until now. It wasn't human love, of course. It was simpler, purer. It was present, the kind that asks for nothing in return. And in that stillness, she began to see what had always been missing in her own life. Not the presence of purpose, but the permission to simply be gentle with herself. Over the next week, she noticed subtle changes. Scout began mimicking Maris's behaviors, lowering his head when she groomed, twitching his ears when she chirped softly to her kittens through the divider. He was learning another species language word by word, gesture by gesture. And somehow, it worked. When Nora entered the room, both would look up in unison. Maris's eyes asked a question Nora could almost understand. "You'll keep him safe." And Nora's gentle nod became her answer. Kindness had become the shared currency in that space, not dominance, not training, not fear. It was astonishing how much cooperation blossomed when no one tried to control the outcome. Caleb noticed it too. He said, "It's like they've decided to raise him together, her, you, and the wild." Nora smiled faintly. "Maybe kindness is just good parenting no matter who you are." "Even for humans?" Caleb asked. "Especially for humans," she replied. Later that night, when everyone else had gone home, Nora sat again in the dim light of the ward. The room smelled faintly of pine bedding and antiseptic. Maris had fallen asleep, her breathing deep and even. Scout, ever restless, trotted clumsily to the divider, pressing his nose to the glass where Nora sat. Without thinking, she placed her hand on the other side. The puppy's small paw rested against the glass opposite hers. His tail gave a hesitant wag. From the shadows, Maris stirred. Her eyes opened glowing gold in the low light. She didn't move toward them. She didn't growl. She simply watched, and then slowly she lowered her head again as if to say, "Go on. You're safe here." In that moment, Nora felt something sacred pass between them. 3 hearts, 3 languages, 1 understanding. The next morning, she wrote in her notes, "Compassion is not learned. It is remembered." Watching Maris and Scout, she realized that kindness isn't a deviation from nature. It's the core of it. When fear drives us apart, kindness reminds us how to belong again. When we stop trying to understand and start simply noticing, life begins to reveal its gentlest patterns. She began to wonder how many acts of quiet mercy go unseen in the wild every day. How many times does an animal shelter another? How many small lives are spared because one creature chose to listen to the language of kindness rather than the reflex of fear? Maybe, she thought, the miracle isn't that these moments are rare. Maybe the miracle is that we're allowed to see them at all. Word had begun to spread about the sanctuary's unlikely family. Volunteers arrived not out of curiosity, but reverence. They spoke more softly in the halls, moved more slowly near the observation glass. Even visitors who came skeptical left different, quieter, thoughtful. One woman, after watching for only 10 minutes, whispered to Nora, "I don't know why, but this makes me want to forgive someone." Nora smiled. That's what kindness does. It doesn't change the past. It just makes the present gentle enough to bear. Caleb had begun editing small clips for public awareness, not for spectacle, but for education. He made sure the footage honored the stillness, the quiet power of coexistence. No narration, no drama, just breathe and light. People watched, people felt. Donations arrived for the sanctuary, food, medicine letters, written in careful cursive, thanking them for reminding us what love looks like. Through it all, Maris remained unchanged, still cautious, still wild, but unmistakably compassionate. Her kittens were growing strong, and Scout, now healthy and bold, followed her every movement like a younger sibling trying to keep up. Sometimes Nora would find herself smiling at the sight the little dog, copying her gait, tripping over his own paws as she leapt onto a low platform. Maris would pause to turn and wait for him to climb. Kindness had become their shared instinct. And in that sanctuary, surrounded by pines and quiet snowmelt, Nora began to believe that maybe kindness wasn't the opposite of wildness. Maybe it was the wild, at its most honest. Weeks later, on a morning bright with spring sunlight, the world outside the sanctuary felt new again. Maris was nearing the end of her pregnancy, her body heavy but strong. Scout had taken to sleeping pressed against the glass between them, as if guarding her the way she once guarded him. Nora watched from her desk, her pen hovering above the page. She whispered, "Kindness always finds its way back home." Because it does. It travels through actions, through echoes, through every life it touches. And soon that circle of care would grow again from the sanctuary walls to something far beyond them. If this story has reached you, it's because kindness travels quietly through rivers, through hearts, through time. It begins where fear ends. Stay with me. In the next part, we'll see how the ripples of this wild act of compassion begin to touch the human world. A reminder that sometimes it takes an animal to teach us how to be human again. Some languages don't need translation. Languages older than speech, carried in the tilt of a head, the warmth of a gaze, the rhythm of breath shared between living things. That morning, inside the Bitterroot Wildlife Center, one such language filled the air. It wasn't English or science or sound. It was kindness, spoken through silence. Nora had stayed the night again. She didn't mean to. She'd promised herself she'd go home, take a shower, maybe sleep in her own bed for once. But when she'd reached the door the night before, she'd heard it, the soft whimper of the puppy, the low rumble of the bobcat's purr in response. And she couldn't leave. So she pulled up a chair beside the glass divider, her notes spread across her lap. In front of her, two lives that should have been enemies slept side by side, one golden and fragile, the other fierce and spotted, yet calm. It was the kind of peace you don't see in textbooks. She whispered mostly to herself. This is what survival really looks like. When people talk about kindness, they often treat it like a choice, something deliberate, almost ceremonial. But watching Maris and Scout Nora realized that kindness is more instinct than intention. It's the natural pull toward warmth, the quiet rebellion against fear. Every morning, Maris greeted the staff with watchful calm, no longer hiding her kittens under her belly when Nora entered. Scout would wag his tail not wildly, but in a slow, cautious rhythm that mirrored the heartbeat of trust. Caleb's camera had captured hundreds of hours of footage by then, yet every frame carried the same truth. Nothing about this was performative. The wild mother didn't know she was teaching humans anything. She was just loving. Love as language. Kindness as instinct. One afternoon, a storm rolled over the mountains, sharp lightning rolling thunder that shook the glass panes of the sanctuary. Scout startled first, his small body trembling under the weight of each booming echo. He whimpered, pressing himself flat against the floor. Maris lifted her head. She could have retreated deeper into the nesting corner, but instead, she stretched one paw over the puppy, curling her body protectively around him. Nora and Caleb stood frozen behind the observation window. Lightning flashed again. Maris didn't flinch. She pressed closer. Her fur absorbed his shaking. Her warmth silenced his fear. Nora whispered, "She's teaching him the world isn't as cruel as it sounds." Caleb nodded, voice thick. "And maybe she's teaching us too." Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the sanctuary held steady. Kindness, Nora thought, isn't about what you feel. It's about what you offer when you have nothing left to give. Maris had every reason to choose distance. She was still recovering, still carrying new life inside her. Yet when faced with fear, not her own, but another's, she responded with comfort. It made Nora think of her patients, the humans who visited her after lectures, their hands trembling as they asked if animals could really feel love. She always said yes. but she had never truly known how until now. It wasn't human love. Of course, it was simpler, purer. It was present, the kind that asks for nothing in return. And in that stillness, she began to see what had always been missing in her own life. Not the presence of purpose, but the permission to simply be gentle with herself. Over the next week, she noticed subtle changes. Scout began mimicking Maris's behaviors, lowering his head when she groomed, twitching his ears when she chirped softly to her kittens through the divider. He was learning another species' language word by word, gesture by gesture. And somehow, it worked. When Nora entered the room, both would look up in unison. Maris's eyes asked a question Nora could almost understand. "You'll keep him safe?" And Nora's gentle nod became her answer. Kindness had become the shared currency in that space, not dominance, not training, not fear. It was astonishing how much cooperation blossomed when no one tried to control the outcome. Caleb noticed it too. He said, "It's like they've decided to raise him together, you in the wild." Nora smiled faintly. "Maybe kindness is just good parenting no matter who you are. Even for humans," Caleb asked. "Especially for humans," she replied. Later that night, when everyone else had gone home, Nora sat again in the dim light of the ward. The room smelled faintly of pine bedding and antiseptic. Maris had fallen asleep, her breathing deep and even. Scout, ever restless, trotted clumsily to the divider, pressing his nose to the glass where Nora sat. Without thinking, she placed her hand on the other side. The puppy's small paw rested against the glass opposite hers. His tail gave a hesitant wag. From the shadows, Marie stirred. Her eyes opened glowing gold in the low light. She didn't move toward them. She didn't growl. She simply watched, and then slowly she lowered her head again as if to say, "Go on. You're safe here." In that moment, Nora felt something sacred pass between them. 3 hearts, 3 languages, 1 understanding. The next morning, she wrote in her notes, "Compassion is not learned. It is remembered." Watching Maris and Scout, she realized that kindness isn't a deviation from nature. It's the core of it. When fear drives us apart, kindness reminds us how to belong again. When we stop trying to understand and start simply noticing, life begins to reveal its gentlest patterns. She began to wonder how many acts of quiet mercy go unseen in the wild every day. How many times does an animal shelter another? How many small lives are spared because one creature chose to listen to the language of kindness rather than the reflex of fear? Maybe, she thought, the miracle isn't that these moments are rare. Maybe the miracle is that we're allowed to see them at all. Word had begun to spread about the sanctuary's unlikely family. Volunteers arrived not out of curiosity but reverence. They spoke more softly and the halls moved more slowly near the observation glass. Even visitors who came skeptical left different, quieter, thoughtful. One woman, after watching for only 10 minutes, whispered to Nora, "I don't know why, but this makes me want to forgive someone." Nora smiled. That's what kindness does. It doesn't change the past. It just makes the present gentle enough to bear. Caleb had begun editing small clips for public awareness, not for spectacle, but for education. He made sure the footage honored the stillness, the quiet power of coexistence. No narration, no drama, just breathe and light. People watched, people felt. Donations arrived for the sanctuary, food medicine letters written in careful cursive, thanking them for reminding us what love looks like. Through it all, Maris remained unchanged, still cautious, still wild, but unmistakably compassionate. Her kittens were growing strong, and Scout, now healthy and bold, followed her every movement, like a younger sibling trying to keep up. Sometimes Nora would find herself smiling at the sight the little dog, copying her gait, tripping over his own paws as she leapt onto a low platform. Maris would pause to turn and wait for him to climb. Kindness had become their shared instinct. And in that sanctuary, surrounded by pines and quiet snowmelt, Nora began to believe that maybe kindness wasn't the opposite of wildness. Maybe it was the wild, at its most honest. Weeks later, on a morning bright with spring sunlight, the world outside the sanctuary felt new again. Maurice was nearing the end of her pregnancy, her body heavy but strong. Scout had taken to sleeping pressed against the glass between them, as if guarding her the way she once guarded him. Nora watched from her desk, her pen hovering above the page. She whispered, "Kindness always finds its way back home." Because it does. It travels through actions, through echoes, through every life it touches. And soon that circle of care would grow again from the sanctuary walls to something far beyond them. If this story has reached you, it's because kindness travels quietly through rivers, through hearts, through time. It begins where fear ends. Stay with me. In the next part, we'll see how the ripples of this wild act of compassion begin to touch the human world, a reminder that sometimes it takes an animal to teach us how to be human again. There are moments when the wild writes its own endings, quiet, perfect, and beyond reason. And beneath the tall pines of Bitterroot, the circle of rescue was about to complete itself. The bobcat, who had once pulled a dying puppy from a frozen river, was now bringing new life into the world. And every heartbeat inside that small sanctuary, human, wild, and in between, seemed to hold its breath to listen. It happened in early April. The snow had melted back into the riverbanks, and the forest floor smelled of thawed earth and new beginnings. For weeks, Nora had been monitoring Maris closely. The bobcat's belly had grown full and round her gait slower, but steady. Even in her final days of pregnancy, she never strayed far from the glass divider that separated her from Scout, the golden puppy she'd rescued months before. At night, Scout would curl up against the glass, his tail brushing faintly in his sleep. And Maris, always watchful, would lower her head until their noses nearly touched through the barrier. To Nora, it looked like a prayer made visible. Two souls who had once met in chaos are now finding peace in proximity. The morning the contractions began, the staff had already prepared the birthing enclosure. Quiet lighting, clean straw, gentle warmth radiating through the floor. Nora dimmed the room to a soft amber glow and whispered to the young assistant beside her, "Let the wild do what it remembers." They watched from behind the safety glass. Maris moved with instinctive precision, circling, kneading the straw, her breath coming steady and sure. She paused only once, turning toward Scout's side of the enclosure. He was awake now, pacing softly, his golden fur brushed with early sunlight. When Maris made that low, familiar chirping sound, Scout pressed his nose to the divider and whimpered. Nora smiled through the tension in her chest. "She's calling to him," she whispered, telling him it's okay. And then the first cry, a sound so small and pure, it silenced the entire sanctuary. Nora's hands gripped the railing, her breath catching as Maris bent down and began to clean her newborn kitten. A second followed, then a third, and finally a fourth, tiny lives, each a spark of color against her mottled coat. Maris moved like water fluid, gentle, sure. No panic, no noise, just the rhythm of nature fulfilling its promise. Caleb, filming from the observation deck, whispered, "She's perfect." Nora nodded, unable to speak. There were no words big enough for what they were witnessing. After the fourth kitten began to breathe on its own, Maris turned toward the Scout again. Her gaze was calm, knowing. And then something none of them expected. She rose slowly, picked up one of her kittens in her mouth, and carried it toward the divider. Nora felt her throat tighten. She wants him closer. Scout stood still, trembling with quiet awe. When Maris lay her kitten down near the glass, she didn't hiss or growl. She chirped that soft, rolling sound of reassurance and pressed her nose to the barrier. Scout answered with a small bark tail sweeping the floor. In that moment, no one in the room breathed, because what they were seeing wasn't instinct or confusion. It was an invitation. The wild was sharing its miracle. Later, when the staff finally stepped away, Nora sat in the empty observation room, her eyes still wet. She thought about how rescue rarely moves in a straight line, how sometimes the one you save ends up saving you. Maris had rescued Scout from the river. Scout had kept her calm through captivity and care. And now, together, they were teaching everyone in that sanctuary a quiet truth. Compassion doesn't end where understanding does. It keeps circling back, reshaping itself, finding new forms. Nora glanced down at her hands, the same hands that had once trembled over tranquilizers and medical charts. She used to believe healing meant control. Now she knew it meant trust. Over the following weeks, life in the sanctuary fell into a tender rhythm. Maris nursed her kittens beneath the watchful canopy of the pine boughs outside the enclosure's skylight. Scout grew stronger, his puppy clumsiness fading into quiet maturity. The staff had long stopped calling him a patient. They simply called him family. Each morning, Nora would find Scout sitting beside the divider, watching the kittens play. Sometimes Maris would gently roll one of the kittens toward him, a silent gesture, as if saying, "Look, this is what you helped me bring into the world." And every time Nora felt that same swell in her chest, that human ache of wonder when you realize the wild isn't something to study. It's something to learn from. The circle was complete. Rescue had become rebirth. Outside the sanctuary walls, bitterroot continued to bloom in its own way. The small-town newspaper ran a front-page story titled, "New Life Beneath the Pines." It wasn't a scientific report or a viral update. It was a love letter. The article described how Maris, the miracle bobcat, had given birth to 4 healthy kittens and how the rescued puppy Scout had become part of their story. One paragraph read, "Maybe kindness is contagious. Maybe it's inherited. But whatever it is, it's alive and well in Bitterroot." The town responded in kind. The local school began a kindness week. The bakery sold bobcat buns to raise money for the sanctuary. An elderly man stopped by one afternoon with a bag of dog treats. "For the golden one," he said softly. Caleb filmed it all, not for fame, but for memory, because some stories deserve to be remembered not as miracles, but as reminders. As spring deepened, Nora often found herself outside under the pine canopy after closing hours. The smell of resin and damp bark reminded her of her childhood when she first dreamed of working with animals. She used to think the wild was something you entered a place apart from the human world. Now she realized it wasn't separate at all. The wild had always lived within her, the longing to protect, to nurture, to connect, even when logic said not to. One evening, as twilight settled, she leaned against the glass where Maris slept with her kittens and Scout dozed nearby. The room was lit by the gentle amber of night lamps. Everything breathing heartbeat stillness seemed to move in unison. She whispered, "You taught me more than any lecture ever could." And though she knew the animals couldn't hear the words, she believed they understood. Because understanding, she thought, is just another word for love. The circle of rescue wasn't just about survival anymore. It had become a living metaphor, a reminder that every act of care carries forward, touching lives unseen. Maris had trusted humans when she didn't have to. Scout had learned gentleness from the very creature he was born to fear. And Nora, the scientist who had once searched for evidence of emotion in data, had found it in the quiet flick of a bobcat's ear and the sigh of a sleeping puppy. It made her wonder how many other stories like this go unnoticed, how many small acts of grace happen every day, unseen beneath the canopy of our noisy world. Maybe she thought miracles aren't rare. Maybe we just forget to look closely enough. One morning, as sunlight spilled through the skylight, one of Maris's kittens, the smallest, a pale silver one, toddled toward the divider. Scout, now grown but still gentle, lowered his head to the glass. The kitten pressed its tiny paw against the same spot. Caleb caught the image on camera, predator's child, and prey's survivor separated by glass, united by instinct. When Nora saw the footage later, her breath caught. "It's all there," she murmured. "The whole story in one touch. Rescue, trust, renewal. The unbroken circle of care that keeps life moving forward." As spring turned towards summer, plans began forming for Maris's eventual release. The kittens would learn to hunt under her guidance in a protected wilderness reserve. Scout, now healthy and strong, would remain nearby at the sanctuary, his presence a living thread to the story that had changed them all. For Nora, letting go would not be easy. But she knew love isn't meant to be contained. It's meant to move, to return, to begin again, somewhere new. And as she stood beneath the whispering pines, watching the wild mother nudge her kittens toward their first sunrise, she understood something she'd been chasing her whole life. Rescue isn't about saving the weak. It's about reminding the world and ourselves that every life, no matter how small or strange, belongs. If this story has stirred something in you, hold it close. Let it remind you that kindness, once given, never disappears. It only changes shape, sometimes into courage, sometimes into forgiveness, sometimes into the smallest paw print pressed against your heart. Stay with me. In the next part, we'll return to that forest ridge where Maris, her kittens, and the golden one will face the quiet moment of parting and the beginning of something even deeper. Every story begins somewhere, but the best ones don't really end. They circle back to where the heart first opened, changed, but still beating with the same quiet wonder. And for Nora Caleb and the town of Bitterroot, that place was the river. The same river that had once tried to take 2 lives was now about to give 5 back. It was midsummer when the decision was made. Maris and her 4 kittens were ready for release. The sanctuary had become their temporary home, but the wild, the scent of pine, the unbound wind, the call of open sky, that was where they belonged. Nora knew this moment would come, but knowing didn't make it easier. She stood beside the open transport crate at dawn, her hand steady but her heart restless. The morning light spilled through the treetops in narrow ribbons, painting everything gold. The kind of light that makes you feel both alive and nostalgic at the same time. Scout, the golden dog, who had once been pulled from the same river, sat quietly beside her tail. Still eyes fixed on Maris through the wire. Caleb's camera was running, but even he was silent. No one wanted to disturb what felt sacred. The wild mother looked calm, stronger, sleeker, now her coat catching the light in shifting shades of bronze. Her kittens rustled inside the crate, curious but patient, their tiny eyes reflecting a world they'd never yet seen without glass between them. Nora knelt beside the crate, whispering words only she and Maris would ever share. "You did good, girl. You did so good." Maris blinked slowly, that same expression of wordless understanding that had crossed between them months before. Then she looked toward the tree line where sunlight touched the horizon and the faint sound of the Bitterroot River murmured in the distance. It was time. Nora unlatches the crate. The door swings open without sound. For a heartbeat, no one moves. Even the wind seems to pause. Then, with a grace that looked like memory, Maris steps out. One paw, then another. Her muscles ripple with quiet confidence. She sniffs the air, turns toward the woods, and in a single smooth motion, she vanishes into the trees. One by one, the kittens follow. The last one, the smallest silver one, pauses to glance back. It's only a second, a blink, a breath, but it's enough to break something open inside everyone watching. Nora feels the tears before she knows they're falling. The sound of the river swells, catching the moment in its current. Caleb lowers his camera. He's filmed hundreds of releases, but none have ever felt like this. Maybe it's because this wasn't just about returning an animal to the wild. It was about returning everyone else to themselves. He turns to Nora, his voice barely a whisper. "You think she'll remember?" Nora smiles through the tears. The wild remembers everything. Scout whines softly beside them. His tail flicks once, then falls still. Nora kneels, resting her hand on his head. "She's where she needs to be," she says. "And so are you." The dog looks back toward the forest, ears perked. A faint sound, the distant chirp of a bobcat, carries through the pines. He doesn't bark. He just listens, because sometimes goodbye isn't loss. It's gratitude spoken in silence. As the sun climbs higher, the small group remains by the river. No one wants to leave. Nora closes her eyes and breathes in the scent of pine and water. The same river that once roared with chaos now whispers like a hymn, steady, forgiving. She thinks back to that first day, the storm, the rescue, the impossible moment when the wild had chosen compassion over instinct. That single act had rewritten everything she knew about life. Science had taught her about survival, but this was something purer. This was love expressed through courage. And courage, she realized, isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the choice to care even when you're afraid. That's what Maris taught her. That's what Scout reminded her. And it's what the river had always been trying to say. Word of the release spread through Bitterroot faster than the morning light. But instead of excitement, what people felt was reverence. At the diner where the story first broke, someone left a bouquet of wildflowers on the counter with a note that read, "For Maris," who reminded us the wild has a heart. The local paper printed one final story, a simple photo of the empty crate in the forest clearing. The headline read, "She returned home." No clickbait, no spectacle, just truth. Caleb's final footage of the release would later be shown in schools, nature centers, and quiet living rooms around the world. Parents watched it with their children. Teachers used it to talk about empathy. And strangers who had never set foot in Montana wrote to the sanctuary saying they had started volunteering, rescuing strays, or planting trees. It was the ripple effect. Again, one act of mercy continuing to travel outward, carried by those who chose to believe in it. Because kindness, once awakened, doesn't sleep again. Weeks later, after the release, Nora took a walk down to the riverbank alone. The same spot where it all began. The water was calm now, a silver ribbon weaving through the valley, carrying the memory of spring floods and quiet miracles. She crouched by the water's edge, brushing her fingers along the current. It was cold, clean alive. Somewhere beyond the trees, Maris was teaching her kittens to hunt, to climb, to listen. Scout, still at the sanctuary, had taken to sleeping by the open window, nose turned toward the woods, and Nora. She no longer felt the ache of endings, only the fullness of cycles completed. She whispered to the river as if it could hear her. "Thank you for giving them back." The wind answered in its own language, a rustle through the pines, gentle and endless. We live in a world that often celebrates noise over nuance, speed over stillness. But every once in a while, a story like this slips through the cracks, reminding us that goodness doesn't need an audience. It just needs a beginning. A single act of kindness, a bobcat diving into a river, a human choosing compassion over fear, a puppy learning to trust again. These are the quiet revolutions that change the world. Because the heart, like a river, finds its way. And when we choose to see through the eyes of love, through the eyes of a wild mother who dared to save something fragile, we remember what being human truly means. That night, back at the sanctuary, Nora watched the sunset through the window of her office. The sky was streaked with amber and rose like the reflection of everything that had ever mattered. Caleb stopped by, camera slung over his shoulder. He didn't need to ask how she was. The quiet between them said enough. They stepped outside together. Scout trotted ahead, tail swaying. The scent of pine was heavy in the air. As they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, the last light of day caught the river below. It shimmered like molten gold, winding through the same path where everything began. Nora smiled faintly. "Full circle," she said. Caleb nodded. "And somehow it feels like the beginning again. Maybe it always does. Because every act of rescue, every spark of compassion sends something forward, something unseen but never lost. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the quiet, timeless conversation between the wild and the human heart. The river, the wind, the breath of life, all whispering the same thing: we belong to each other. If this story touched something in you, take a moment. Look at your own life. The small rescues, the quiet kindnesses, the moments where you chose compassion even when it cost you. Those moments matter. They ripple outward more than you'll ever know. And if you'd like to keep stories like this alive, stories that heal, stories that remind us who we are, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps more people find these quiet truths. And if your heart feels called to do more, you can leave a super thanks or donate directly to help rescue and heal wild animals like Maris, creatures who remind us that love and loyalty exist far beyond our understanding. Because every life you help save becomes part of the same river, flowing forward, carrying kindness farther than the eye can see.